The Vanishing. November 10th, 1976. A divorce was finalized in Los Angeles County Court. The marriage had lasted exactly 3 years, 6 months, and 15 days. Kathryn Hawn walked out of that courthouse and did something extraordinary, something that Hollywood had never seen before and hasn't seen since. She disappeared. Completely. Totally. Forever. Not the kind of disappearance where you pop up on a reality show 15 years later. Not the kind where you write a tell-all book or give exclusive interviews to Vanity Fair. Kathryn Hawn, the third wife of Dean Martin, one of the most famous entertainers on planet Earth, simply vanished in the thin air like smoke dissipating in the California breeze. And here's what makes this story absolutely mind-blowing. She was only 26 years old when she married him, 29 when she left. She had everything: money, fame, connections to every A-lister in Hollywood. She'd been married to the king of cool himself. Frank Sinatra had attended her wedding. She lived in a Beverly Hills mansion. She wore designer clothes and diamonds that cost more than most people made in a decade, and she threw it all away, walked away from it like it was nothing, like she'd been living someone else's life, and finally remembered who she really was. For nearly 50 years, people have been asking the same question. Where did Kathryn Hawn go? More importantly, why did she go? What happened in that 3-year marriage that made a young woman choose complete anonymity over the glittering life of a Hollywood ex-wife? This isn't just a story about a failed celebrity marriage. This is a story about a woman who entered the most dazzling spotlight in America and then deliberately, consciously, permanently turned it off. This is the story of Kathryn Hawn, the woman who married Dean Martin and then vanished forever before the spotlight. To understand Kathryn's story, you have to understand where she came from. Born Kathryn May Hawn on November 30th, 1947, in Steubenville, Ohio, the very same small town where Dean Martin grew up. It's almost poetic, isn't it? They came from the same place, but their paths couldn't have been more different. Dean had escaped Steubenville decades earlier, dropped out of high school, boxed, dealt cards in illegal casinos, and clawed his way to the top of Hollywood royalty. By the time Kathryn was born, Dean was already on his way to becoming a household name, performing with Jerry Lewis in nightclubs across America. Kathryn's early life is shrouded in mystery, not because she was hiding anything, but because she was normal, beautifully, blessedly normal. She didn't chase fame as a child. She wasn't a child actress or a beauty queen. She was just Kathryn, a girl from Ohio who eventually made her way to California, like millions of other young Americans searching for something better. By the early 1970s, Kathryn had settled into life in Beverly Hills, working as a receptionist at the Jean Shacco hair salon. Now, this wasn't just any salon. Jean Shacco's place was where Hollywood came to get beautiful. Movie stars, producers, moguls, they all walked through those doors. Kathryn saw them all. She checked them in, took their coats, made their appointments, smiled professionally, and kept her distance. She was blonde, beautiful, and composed. She had the kind of quiet elegance that doesn't scream for attention, but commands it anyway. The other women who worked at the salon noticed how celebrities would try to chat with her, flirt with her, ask her out. Kathryn always declined politely. She wasn't impressed by fame. She'd seen too much of it up close. She knew what it cost. Kathryn had a daughter, Sasha, from a previous relationship. Being a single mother in the early 1970s, Hollywood wasn't easy, but Kathryn managed. She worked hard, took care of her daughter, lived modestly, and stayed out of trouble. She wasn't looking for a celebrity husband. She wasn't looking for any husband. She was just trying to live her life with dignity and grace. But life has a funny way of finding you when you're not looking. And in 1970, life found Kathryn Hawn in the form of a man named Dean Martin, a 53-year-old legend who was about to blow up his entire life. Enter the king of cool. When Kathryn met Dean Martin, he was at a crossroads. Actually, crossroads is too gentle a word. He was in the middle of an absolute crisis. Dean had been married to his second wife, Jean Beager, for 24 years. 24 years. They had 3 children together. They'd built an empire together. Jean had been by his side to the peak of his career, through the Rat Pack years, through his transformation from nightclub singer to television icon. But in 1972, Dean filed for divorce. The reasons were complicated. Dean's career was changing. The Rat Pack era was ending. Frank Sinatra was pulling back. The world was different. Rock and roll had taken over. The kind of cool that Dean represented, that smooth, boozy, tuxedo-wearing cool, was starting to feel like it belonged to a different era. Dean was also changing personally. He'd always been a homebody, despite his playboy image. He loved his kids. He was home for dinner every night when he wasn't working. But something had shifted. Maybe it was a midlife crisis. Maybe it was exhaustion from maintaining the Dean Martin persona for so long. Maybe it was genuine incompatibility with Jean that had finally become too much to ignore. Whatever the reason, the divorce was filed in 1972 and finalized in 1973. 1 week after the divorce papers were signed, Dean Martin, 55 years old, one of the most famous men in America, walked into the Jean Chaco hair salon and met 26-year-old Catherine Hawn. The story goes that they were introduced by mutual friends. Frank Calcagnini, a family friend, played matchmaker. But the reality is more complex. Dean had probably seen Catherine at the salon before. She'd probably checked him in for appointments, handed him magazines, offered him coffee. He'd noticed her. How could he not? But this time was different. This time Dean wasn't married. This time he was free. This time he was vulnerable. And Catherine, with her quiet strength and her complete lack of interest in his celebrity, must have seemed like exactly what he needed. Someone who saw him as a man, not as a legend. Someone who didn't want anything from him except his company. They started dating almost immediately. And within months, Dean Martin had made a decision. He was going to marry Catherine Hawn. He was going to start over. He was going to prove that at 55, he could still surprise everyone. He was going to have a fairy tale wedding and a beautiful young wife, and everything was going to be perfect. Except nothing in Hollywood is ever perfect. Nothing. The fairy tale wedding. April 25th, 1973. Less than a month after his divorce from Jean was finalized, Dean Martin married Catherine Hawn in his Bel Air mansion. And when I say he spared no expense, I mean he absolutely went for broke. This wasn't just a wedding. This was a statement. This was Dean Martin proving to Hollywood, to Jean and to himself that he'd made the right decision. The wedding cost somewhere between $50,000 and $100,000. In 1973 dollars. Adjusted for inflation, that's over $500,000 today. For one day, for one ceremony, Dean imported lilacs from France. He had 22 cages of white doves shipped in from Europe. The decorations were extravagant, bordering on absurd. Everything was white and gold and dripping with opulence. Frank Sinatra was there, of course. The whole Rat Pack showed up. Hollywood royalty filled the mansion. Photographers captured Catherine in her wedding dress, looking absolutely radiant, but also, if you look closely at those photos, slightly overwhelmed. She was marrying Dean Martin. The Dean Martin, the man whose records her mother probably owned. The man who'd been famous since before she was born. The age gap was impossible to ignore. 29 years separated them. Dean was 55. Catherine was 26. He had 7 biological children, most of them close to Catherine's age. His eldest daughter, Claudia, was 29, 3 years older than Catherine. His eldest son, Craig, was 31. Catherine was about to become stepmother to people older than she was. But on that April day in 1973, none of that seemed to matter. Dean looked happy. Actually happy, not the cool, detached happiness of a stage persona, but genuinely, vulnerably happy. Catherine looked beautiful and poised. Frank Sinatra raised a glass and called it the most beautiful wedding he'd ever seen. The doves were released. The champagne flowed. The music played. It was perfect, absolutely perfect, like a Hollywood ending. Except this wasn't the ending. This was just the beginning. And the beginning of something beautiful often looks exactly like the beginning of something tragic. After the wedding, Dean legally adopted Catherine's daughter, Sasha. This was a big deal. Dean was integrating Catherine completely into his life, into his family. Sasha became Sasha Martin. She was now part of one of Hollywood's most famous families. Catherine had gone from being a single mother working at a hair salon to being Mrs. Dean Martin, mistress of a Beverly Hills mansion, mother to a newly adopted daughter, and stepmother to 7 other children. It should have been everything. It should have been enough. It should have been the start of a beautiful new chapter in both their lives. So why wasn't it life in the golden cage? The reality of being married to Dean Martin was nothing like the fantasy. Catherine discovered this almost immediately. She'd gone from a modest, private life to living in a fishbowl. Everywhere she went, people stared. Photographers followed her. Tabloids wrote about her. She was Dean Martin's new wife, the young blonde, the former receptionist who landed the king of cool. She was never just Catherine. She was always Dean Martin's wife. And that identity came with expectations she hadn't fully understood when she said, "I do." The mansion was enormous, but somehow suffocating. Dean had his routines. He'd wake up late, spend hours alone, play golf, see his friends from the industry. He was 55 and set in his ways. Catherine was 26 and still figuring out who she was. Their rhythms didn't match. Their interests didn't align. The age gap that had seemed romantic during their whirlwind courtship now felt like a canyon they couldn't cross. And then there were the children. 7 of them, all with their own relationships with Dean, all with their own feelings about this new young wife who was suddenly part of their lives. Some of them were kind to Catherine. Others were distant. A few were openly hostile. Can you blame them? Their father had just divorced their mother after 24 years and immediately married a woman younger than some of them. It was a lot to process. Catherine tried. She really tried. She showed up to family dinners. She made an effort with the kids. She supported Dean's career. She attended his shows. She smiled for photographs. She played the role of Mrs. Dean Martin with grace and dignity. But inside, she was drowning. Dean's career was also changing during these years, and not necessarily for the better. The final season of the Dean Martin Show aired in 1973 to 1974 and had been retooled into the Dean Martin Celebrity Roast format, requiring less of Dean's personal involvement. He was scaling back. He was tired. The man Catherine had married was not the vibrant, energetic performer of the 1960s. He was an older man, exhausted from decades in the spotlight, dealing with his own demons. Dean had always had a complicated relationship with fame. He played the drunk on stage, but in reality, he was a devoted father and husband who preferred quiet evenings at home to Hollywood parties. But he was also a man who'd been performing for so long that he didn't know how to stop performing. Even at home, Catherine sometimes wondered if she was seeing the real Dean or just another version of the character he played. The truth is, Dean was still in love with Jean. He'd never stopped loving her. The divorce had been a mistake born of midlife crisis and confusion and exhaustion. And everyone knew it, including Catherine. Especially Catherine. The invisible walls. The ghost of Jean Beager haunted Catherine's marriage from day one. It wasn't anything overt. Dean didn't talk about Jean constantly. He didn't keep photos of her around the house. But she was there in every corner of their life together. The mansion had been Jean's home. The furniture, the decorations, the gardens, Jean had chosen them all. Catherine was living in another woman's house, sleeping in another woman's bed, trying to be wife to a man who'd already had the great love of his life. Friends and family would slip up, calling Catherine Jean by mistake. Dean's children would talk about when Mom used to, and then catch themselves, remembering that Catherine was there. The comparisons were endless and unspoken, but always present. Jean had been with Dean for 24 years. She'd raised his children. She'd been there during the peak of his career. What could Catherine possibly offer that Jean hadn't already given him? The age gap became more pronounced as time went on. Dean was slowing down. He wanted quiet evenings, early bedtimes, peaceful days. Catherine was in her 20s. She had energy. She had dreams. She had a whole life ahead of her. But she was trapped in the life of a man 3 decades older, living in his shadow, suffocating under the weight of expectations she could never meet. Dean's friends were all his age or older. The Rat Pack guys, the Vegas crowd. They were lovely to Catherine, but they treated her like a kid. Frank Sinatra, Sammy Davis Jr., Joey Bishop. They'd known Dean forever. They'd known Jean forever. Catherine was the outsider, the young trophy wife, the mistake Dean had made when he was going through his crisis. And Catherine felt it. All of it. Every single day. She felt like a stranger in her own life. She'd wake up in that enormous mansion and wonder how she'd gotten there. She'd look in the mirror and barely recognize herself. The woman staring back at her was wearing expensive clothes and perfect makeup, but behind her eyes was someone screaming to get out. She couldn't talk to Dean about it. How could she? He'd given her everything. The mansion, the money, the adoption of Sasha, the legitimacy of being a Martin. He'd made her part of Hollywood royalty. She was supposed to be grateful. She was supposed to be happy. But she wasn't. She was miserable. And Dean, bless him, didn't see it. Or maybe he did see it, but didn't know how to fix it. He was dealing with his own regrets, his own realization that maybe divorcing Jean had been a terrible mistake. He'd married Catherine thinking she would make him feel young again, thinking she would be a fresh start. But you can't outrun your past. You can't marry your way into a new life. Dean was learning this the hard way. By 1975, 2 years into the marriage, they were essentially living separate lives under the same roof. Dean had even moved into a different bedroom, transforming an office into his personal space. They'd have dinner together sometimes. They'd attend events together when necessary. But the intimacy was gone. The connection was gone. They were two strangers sharing an address. Catherine had tried everything. She tried being the perfect wife. She tried giving Dean space. She tried involving herself in his world. She tried maintaining her own identity. Nothing worked. The fundamental problem was simple and insurmountable. She was not Jean, and Dean wanted Jean. Catherine realized, with growing clarity, that she'd been a rebound, a beautiful, well-meaning rebound, but a rebound nonetheless. Dean had married her to convince himself he could move on, but he couldn't, and neither could she. 3 years and gone. November 10th, 1976. The divorce was finalized. 3 years, 6 months, and 15 days after they'd said their vows under cages of white doves and imported French lilacs. The paperwork cited irreconcilable differences, that beautiful, meaningless phrase that covers a multitude of failed promises and broken dreams. But here's what's remarkable about the divorce. There was no drama, no tabloid warfare, no, he said, she said, battles played out in the press. Catherine and Dean handled their separation with the same quiet dignity that had characterized their entire marriage. They didn't trash each other. They didn't fight over money. They didn't use the media as a weapon. Dean made sure Catherine was taken care of financially. Rumors suggest she received a generous settlement, enough to live comfortably for the rest of her life. He didn't fight her on anything. In his way, Dean felt guilty. He knew he'd used Catherine, even if he hadn't meant to. He'd married her to fill a hole that only Jean could fill. It wasn't fair to Catherine, and somewhere deep down, Dean knew it. Catherine walked away with her dignity intact, with financial security, and with her daughter Sasha, who maintained a relationship with Dean and the Martin children even after the divorce. Sasha would always be a Martin, legally and emotionally. Dean had kept that promise. But Catherine herself? Catherine made a different choice. She chose to disappear. And I mean truly disappear. Not to Palm Springs or New York or Europe. She disappeared into normalcy, into anonymity, into the life she'd had before Dean Martin walked into that hair salon and changed everything. Within months of the divorce, Catherine Hawn was gone from public life. No interviews, no tell-all book deals, despite what publishers undoubtedly offered her. No appearances on talk shows. No attempt to leverage her 3 years as Mrs. Dean Martin into any kind of career or continued fame. She just vanished, like she'd been a ghost all along, and finally decided to stop haunting Hollywood. And here's the truly incredible part. Dean Martin, meanwhile, immediately began the process of reconciling with Jean. He didn't even wait a decent interval. As soon as the ink was dry on his divorce from Catherine, Dean was back in Jean's life. They never remarried, but they became close again. They attended family events together. They supported each other through the tragedies that would follow, including the devastating death of their son Dean Paul in a plane crash in 1987. Catherine must have known this would happen. She must have seen it coming. Maybe that's why she left so completely. Maybe seeing Dean with Jean, seeing him finally get what he'd wanted all along, would have been too much to bear. Or maybe she'd already grieved the marriage long before it officially ended. Maybe by the time the judge signed those papers, Catherine had already said her goodbyes and moved on emotionally. Whatever her reasons, Catherine Hawn walked away from Hollywood and never looked back. Not once. Not even for a moment. And in doing so, she became one of the most intriguing figures in Hollywood history. The woman who had it all and chose to have nothing instead. The ghost of Hollywood. For nearly 20 years after her divorce, Catherine Hawn lived in complete obscurity. No one knew where she was. No one knew what she was doing. Occasionally, a tabloid would try to track her down, hoping for that exclusive interview, that dramatic revelation. They never found her. Or if they did, she refused to talk. The only time Catherine Hawn was seen in public again was December 25th, 1995, Christmas Day, the day Dean Martin died. Dean had been battling respiratory failure, the result of decades of smoking and a lifetime lived on his own terms. He died at home, surrounded by some of his children. He was 78 years old. At Dean's funeral, she appeared. Catherine Hawn, now 48 years old, stood among the mourners. She didn't make a scene. She didn't try to get attention. She simply paid her respects to the man she'd been married to for 3 years, 2 decades earlier. Jean was there too, of course. The 2 women, the second and third wives of Dean Martin, standing in the same room, mourning the same complicated man. And then, after the funeral, Catherine disappeared again. That was the last time anyone saw her publicly. The last confirmed sighting of Catherine Hawn. She would have been 48. Still young. Still beautiful. Presumably. Still with her whole life ahead of her. And she chose to live that life completely out of the public eye. Reports suggest Catherine might have moved back to Ohio. Back to where she came from. Back to Steubenville, perhaps the same small town where Dean Martin had been born, completing some kind of poetic circle. Other reports say she stayed in California, but lived under a different name, in a small town where nobody knew who she'd been. The truth is, nobody knows for sure. And that's exactly how Catherine wanted it. She'd made her choice decades earlier, walking out of that courthouse in 1976. She chose privacy. She chose anonymity. She chose to be Catherine Hawn, whoever that was, instead of Dean Martin's ex-wife forever. Her daughter Sasha maintained relationships with the Martin family. She stayed close to her adoptive father and her step-siblings. She had a life that included being part of the Martin legacy. But Catherine was done with all of that. She'd had her 3 years in the spotlight and decided it wasn't for her. Most people would kill for what she walked away from. Catherine walked away and never looked back. Today, Catherine Hawn would be 77 years old. She's presumably still alive, living somewhere quietly, contentedly, far from the glare of cameras and the whispers of gossip. She's never given an interview about her time with Dean. She's never written a memoir. She's never capitalized on those 3 years in any way. The choice of silence. So, why did Catherine Hawn vanish? After all this, after telling you this entire story, you're probably wondering what the real reason was. What was the thing that made her choose complete obscurity over the kind of fame most people dream about? Here's what I think. Here's the truth that makes the most sense when you look at all the pieces. Catherine Hawn vanished because she realized something that most people never figure out. Fame isn't real. Being Mrs. Dean Martin wasn't her life. It was a role she was playing. And the moment she stopped playing it, she could go back to being herself, whoever that was. Catherine had lived through 3 years of being someone she wasn't. 3 years of smiling for cameras, of attending parties with people who didn't really know her, of living in a house that would never feel like home, of being married to a man who loved someone else. Those 3 years taught her something valuable. They taught her what she didn't want. And sometimes knowing what you don't want is just as important as knowing what you do want. She didn't want fame. She didn't want money. Not if it came with the cost of living in public. She didn't want to be a celebrity or an ex-wife or a cautionary tale or an inspiration or any of the things Hollywood would have turned her into if she'd stayed. She wanted to be normal. Beautifully, blessedly normal. The thing she'd been before Dean Martin. The thing she could be again if she'd just walk away completely. And walking away completely was the only option that made sense. If she'd stayed in Hollywood, if she tried to maintain any connection to that world, she would have always been Dean Martin's ex-wife. She would have been the young woman who married the legend and it didn't work out. She would have been a footnote in someone else's story forever. By disappearing, by choosing total anonymity, Catherine wrote her own ending. She took control of her narrative by refusing to let there be a narrative at all. Think about what she gave up. Book deals worth millions. Movie deals. Reality shows. She could have dined out on those 3 years for the rest of her life. She could have been on every talk show, every podcast, every documentary about Dean Martin. She could have been famous in her own right, parlaying her brief marriage into a career as a Hollywood personality. But she didn't want any of that. That's the part that's so hard for people to understand. In a culture that obsessed with fame, with being seen, with mattering publicly, Catherine Hawn chose to not matter at all to anyone except herself and the people who truly knew her. And maybe that's the most radical thing a person can do. In Hollywood, in America, in this world where everyone is desperately trying to be somebody, Catherine Hawn chose to be nobody. And in choosing to be nobody, she became unforgettable. The woman who vanished. The mystery that endures. The third wife of Dean Martin who disappeared and was never seen again. Catherine Hawn's legacy is her absence, her silence, her refusal to play the game everyone expected her to play. She married one of the most famous men in the world, lived in his shadow for 3 years, and then walked back into her own light. Wherever she is now, whatever name she's living under, I hope she's happy. I hope she found the peace and normalcy she was looking for. I hope those 3 years in the spotlight were worth it, not because of what she gained, but because of what she learned to leave behind. Catherine Hawn's story isn't about Dean Martin. It's about a woman who had the courage to choose herself over fame, who valued her privacy more than prestige, who understood that sometimes the best way to win is to stop playing the game entirely. That's why she vanished. Because she could. Because she wanted to. Because living quietly on her own terms was worth more than living loudly on everyone else's. And you know what? I think that makes her the coolest person in this entire story. Even cooler than the King of Cool himself.